Be me, SEO department head at a small but growing digital agency. It's a pretty good gig. I have my own team, a decent amount of autonomy. The only real problem is the team itself. It's almost entirely men. I inherited them when I was promoted a little over a year ago. The previous manager was a guy, naturally, and he'd built a team that reflected his own biases. So now it's my job to not only deliver results for our clients, but also to detoxify the workspace. It's like two jobs in one, honestly. Most days, it feels like the second job is the harder one. I remember this one morning meeting, maybe a few months back. It was a Tuesday or a Wednesday. We were discussing a major client, a big e-commerce site whose traffic had plateaued. I was trying to foster a collaborative environment, get some fresh, creative ideas on the table. I asked everyone for their initial thoughts. Silence. Just the sound of someone typing and the hum of the server room down the hall. This was typical. They'd clam up, afraid to speak. I always felt it was a form of passive resistance. Finally, our lead technical guy spoke up. He's one of the older ones, been with the company forever. Smart, but very set in his ways. He started talking about server response times and schema markup, really getting into the weeds. He brought up some data on the screen, pointing at charts and log files. He suggested a complete overhaul of the site's technical backend. His tone was so absolute, so declarative. He said this was the only way to achieve a significant ranking boost. I let him finish his little presentation. The other guys were nodding along like he was delivering a sermon from a mountain. I had to intervene, of course. I smiled patiently and thanked him for his very thorough analysis. Then I explained that while technical SEO is important, it's not the whole picture. I said we needed to think about the user's journey, the brand's narrative, the holistic digital experience. I used the whiteboard to draw a diagram showing how content strategy and user intent were interconnected. He tried to interrupt me, to say something about crawl budget. I just held up a hand gently. I told him I appreciated his passion, but his approach was a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It was aggressive, a brute force method that didn't respect the nuance of the brand. He just shut down completely. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and stared at the table for the rest of the meeting. His fragile ego was clearly bruised. I saw one of the junior guys shift uncomfortably in his seat. I made a mental note of that. He was probably feeling the peer pressure to conform to that aggressive mindset. In the end, I decided we would focus on a new content initiative, something more empathetic and story-driven. The team just sort of mumbled their agreement. I left the meeting feeling a little drained, but also certain I'd made the right call. It wasn't just about SEO. It was about changing the way they thought about problems. A few weeks later, the numbers for that client came in. They weren't good. Organic traffic was down by about 10%. Keyword rankings for their main products had slipped. I knew instantly what had happened. The team hadn't fully committed to my vision. Their passive resistance, their reluctance to embrace a new way of thinking, had sabotaged the project. I called another meeting to go over the results. I put the analytics report on the main screen for everyone to see. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone calm and inquisitive. I asked the team to help me understand what went wrong. Again, silence. They just stared at the screen, at the red downward trending lines. The lead tech guy looked like he wanted to say something, but he kept his mouth shut. Probably for the best. I explained that results like this happen when a team isn't aligned. I talked about the importance of trusting leadership and committing to a unified strategy. I said it felt like some people were still stuck in an old adversarial mindset, seeing every problem as a nail that needed a hammer. My gaze drifted over the men in the room. I wanted them to understand that this was a collective failure, born from a lack of cohesion. It was a learning opportunity for all of us, but especially for them. They needed to learn how to collaborate in a more modern, less confrontational way. I assigned them the task of ideating on how we could improve our internal communication to prevent this from happening again. They just nodded. No one made eye contact. The atmosphere in the office was tense for the rest of the week. I could feel them blaming me, but they didn't understand the bigger picture. I was trying to build something better, and they were fighting me every step of the way. The owner of the agency is a man named Alexander. He's very hands-off, usually. He hired me to run the department, and he lets me do my job. He's all about the bottom line, which is fine. I understood that my methods would take time to show a financial return. You can't undo years of ingrained toxic culture overnight. But he started getting a little more involved around the time we lost that big e-commerce client. The client didn't just leave. They sent a scathing email. Alexander forwarded it to me without comment. The email mentioned a lack of clear strategy and a fundamental misunderstanding of our technical needs. It was obviously written by their head of IT, probably a guy just like my lead tech. They just didn't get what I was trying to do. They were looking for a quick, dirty fix, and I was offering a sustainable, long-term brand evolution. I wrote a long, detailed email back to Alexander explaining the situation. I outlined how the client's rigid, old-fashioned perspective was incompatible with our forward-thinking approach. I framed it as a good thing, really. We were shedding clients who weren't a good cultural fit. He never replied to that email. The breaking point came about a month after that. My lead tech guy, the one who was always so resistant, handed in his resignation. He gave 2 weeks' notice. No big drama. He said he found another opportunity that was a better fit for his skill set. I knew what that was code for. He wanted to go to a place where his aggressive, simplistic way of doing things would be celebrated. A place where he could be another cog in the patriarchal machine. I wasn't sad to see him go, to be honest. I saw it as an opportunity to rebuild the team with people who were more aligned with my vision. Maybe I could even hire a woman for the role. That would certainly help balance the energy in the room. I was actually feeling optimistic. Then I got the calendar invite from Alexander. Urgent meeting, the title said. Just the two of us. In his office, in 10 minutes. That was unusual. He never did that. I assumed he wanted to discuss the plan for hiring the tech lead's replacement. I gathered my notes and my thoughts on the ideal candidate profile. I was ready to make a strong case for diversifying the team. I walked down the hall to his office, feeling confident. I was the head of the department. I was the expert. He needed my guidance. I knocked on his door. He just said, "Come in," without looking up. The vibe in the room was cold. He wasn't at his desk. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city. On the small conference table in the middle of the room, there were 3 pieces of paper laid out in a neat row. I didn't know it at the time, but walking into that room was the beginning of the worst period of my professional life. He turned from the window and gestured toward the chair opposite the table. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, watching me. It felt like an interrogation. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. I sat down, placing my notebook on the table. I tried to start the conversation on my own terms. I started talking about the resignation, framing it as a positive development for the team's culture. He held up his hand to stop me. "I don't want to talk about your hiring plans," he said. His voice was flat. He pointed to the 3 papers on the table. "I want to talk about these." I looked down. The first paper was a printout of the final analytics report from the e-commerce client we'd lost. The downward trends were highlighted in red. The second was a copy of their contract termination letter. A sentence about unacceptable performance drops was circled with a pen. The third was the resignation email from my lead tech. I felt a flash of anger. This was a complete ambush. He was taking their side, the side of the men who couldn't handle a strong female leader. I started to explain the context behind each document. I talked about the client's unreasonable expectations, the tech lead's resistance to change. I tried to make him see the larger pattern of male fragility I was dealing with every single day. He let me talk for about 5 minutes. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When I finally ran out of steam, the silence in the room was heavy. Then he spoke. He told me that the company was losing money. He said that in the year since I'd taken over, my department's client retention rate had dropped by 40%. He said that our agency, which used to be known for getting solid, measurable results, was now getting a reputation for being all talk and no action. He picked up the resignation email. He told me that the tech lead had been with him since he started the company in his garage. He said the guy was the best technical SEO in the city, and that he'd confided in Alexander that he felt his professional expertise was being constantly belittled and dismissed for ideological reasons. My face felt hot. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was twisting everything. This wasn't about expertise. It was about a toxic employee refusing to adapt. I opened my mouth to say that, but he cut me off. "No," he said, his voice dropping a little lower. "You don't get to talk now. You get to listen." He told me he was at a crossroads. The business was failing, not slowly, quickly. He said he had invested his life savings into this company. He had employees who had mortgages and families to support. And my department, the department responsible for driving growth for our clients, was actively sinking the ship. He looked me straight in the eye. He said he believed I was smart, and he knew I was passionate. But my passion was focused on the wrong thing. I wasn't running an SEO department. I was running a social experiment, and he was done funding it. My heart was pounding. I thought he was going to fire me. I started thinking about having to find a new job, about the humiliation. But he didn't fire me. He offered me a deal, an ultimatum, really. He laid out the new rules. Rule number 1. From that moment on, all strategic decisions were to be based exclusively on data and projected ROI. No more narratives or holistic journeys, unless I could back them up with hard numbers. Rule number 2. My job was to manage workflow, not people's personalities. I was forbidden from holding meetings about team cohesion or workplace energy. No more lectures on communication styles. Rule number 3. And he leaned forward when he said this one. I was to give my team complete autonomy on how they achieved their results. If a team member proposed a technical solution and it was sound, I had to approve it. No more overriding their expertise with my vision. He said, your job is to clear roadblocks, not to be won. I was speechless. He was stripping me of all my authority. He wanted me to be a glorified project manager. He was essentially telling me to stand back and let the men run things their way. I felt sick. It was a complete betrayal. I asked him what would happen if I refused. He just pointed at the door. He said he'd accept my resignation, and then he would promote one of the juniors to acting team lead and hope he could salvage what was left. He was serious. My entire career, my entire belief system, was being challenged in the coldest, most corporate way imaginable. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I had no choice. I had bills to pay. I couldn't afford to be unemployed. I looked at him, at the hard, determined look on his face. I felt so alone. I just nodded my head, unable to speak. I whispered, "Okay." He seemed to relax, just a little. He told me this was my one and only chance. He said, "Let's see what happens when you just let your experts do their jobs." I walked out of his office feeling completely numb. I went back to my desk and just sat there, staring at my screen. I was furious. I was humiliated. And I was also completely certain of one thing. This was going to be an absolute disaster. And when it all came crashing down, I wouldn't be the one taking the blame. He had made his choice. He had sided with the patriarchy. Now he would have to live with the consequences. The next morning was one of the strangest of my life. I walked into the office feeling like a ghost. The team was already there, heads down, working. They didn't know about my meeting with Alexander. They just knew their tech lead was leaving at the end of the week. The atmosphere was subdued, tense. We had our regular Monday morning project kickoff meeting scheduled. Usually, this was my stage. I would set the tone for the week, outline my strategic priorities, and delegate tasks based on my vision. This time, I had no idea what to do. I walked into the conference room and took my usual spot at the head of the table. They all looked at me, waiting. I took a deep breath. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding hollow, even to me. "Let's go over the active projects. What are the immediate priorities?" I didn't offer any high-level strategy. I just asked a question. The junior guy, the one who always seemed the most intimidated, spoke up first. He mentioned a client whose site speed was abysmal, causing their bounce rate to skyrocket. He timidly suggested that we could implement some of the technical fixes the departing tech lead had been advocating for months. He looked at me, expecting to be shut down. I felt a muscle in my jaw clench. This was my first test. Alexander's words were ringing in my ears. "Your job is to clear roadblocks." I just wanted to argue. I wanted to explain how site speed was only one piece of a much larger user experience puzzle. But I couldn't. I just nodded. "Okay, makes sense. Put a plan together and run with it." The look of surprise on his face was almost comical. He just blinked. "Really? Just like that?" "Yes," I said, forcing a neutral expression. "Just like that?" Then another team member brought up a different client. He had a complex, data-driven plan for link building that involved a lot of technical outreach and analysis. It was the kind of dry, impersonal strategy I hated. It was all about metrics and authority, with no thought for brand voice or storytelling. Old me would have vetoed it instantly. New me just said, "Sounds logical, go for it." And so it went for the entire meeting. They would propose a straightforward, data-backed, technical solution. I would approve it. I felt like a robot, a rubber stamp. When the meeting ended, they all just kind of filed out, looking confused but also energized. I saw two of them huddled by the whiteboard, already sketching out a technical diagram. I went back to my desk and felt a profound sense of uselessness. They didn't need me. They were perfectly happy executing their little technical tasks. I spent the rest of the week in a fog. I forwarded emails. I approved timesheets. I sat in on client calls and said nothing, letting the team lead the technical discussions. On Friday, we said goodbye to the tech lead. There was no big farewell party. He just packed up his desk, shook a few hands, and left. He didn't even make a point of saying goodbye to me. I felt a petty sense of satisfaction from that. It proved he was the one with the problem, not me. The first few weeks of the new regime were quiet. The team was busy, really busy. The office, which had often been silent with tension, was now filled with the low hum of collaboration. I'd overhear them debating the merits of different coding languages or the best way to structure a sitemap. They were speaking a language I understood, but had always deemed secondary. My role became purely administrative. Alexander didn't speak to me much. He'd just give me a polite nod when we passed in the hallway. I knew he was watching, waiting. I was waiting too, waiting for the whole thing to fall apart. I was convinced that without my strategic oversight, they would eventually hit a wall. They were all technicians, tacticians. They could see the trees, but not the forest. Sooner or later, a client would demand a big-picture creative strategy, and they wouldn't know what to do. And then Alexander would have to come crawling back to me. I just had to be patient. I started documenting everything. I kept a private file with notes on every decision they made without my input. I was building my case for when the inevitable failure occurred. About a month in, the first set of client reports came out under the new system. I opened the first one with a sense of grim anticipation. It was for the client whose site speed they had worked on. I looked at the organic traffic chart. It wasn't down, it was up by 15%. Their bounce rate had been cut in half. I stared at the screen, trying to understand. It had to be a fluke, a seasonal spike, maybe. I opened the next report, the one for the client with the technical link building campaign. Their domain authority had increased by 10 points. They were now ranking on the first page for 5 of their most competitive keywords. I went through every single report. It was the same story for every client. Modest gains in some cases, significant jumps in others. But not a single red arrow, not one. It didn't make sense. This was all just technical busy work. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't marketing. It was just plumbing. How could fixing the plumbing lead to such immediate results? I didn't say anything to the team. I just sent out the reports with a one-line email. See attached for this month's performance metrics. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. The next month was even more pronounced. The initial gains weren't a fluke. They were the beginning of a trend. The team was on fire. Having been given autonomy, they were now taking initiative. They were running tests, building custom tools, and proactively finding problems to solve without me even having to ask. One afternoon, the junior guy who had been so timid before knocked on the door of my office. He had a huge smile on his face. He showed me his screen. He had built a script that automated a tedious reporting task that used to take hours. Now we can use that time for actual analysis, he said, beaming with pride. I should have been happy. It was an objective improvement, but all I felt was a pang of something ugly. Resentment, maybe. He didn't do that for me. He only did it once I was out of the way. The successes started to pile up. We landed a new client, a big tech startup. They didn't sign with us because of a fancy creative pitch from me. They signed because one of my guys did a free, unsolicited technical audit of their site, found a critical indexing error, and sent it to their CTO. The CTO was so impressed by the proactive, no-nonsense approach that he signed a 6-month contract the next day. Alexander forwarded me the email chain. The only comment he added was a single word: good. The team celebrated the win with a round of high fives. I just watched from my office door, feeling more and more like an outsider. The financial situation of the company completely turned around. We weren't just solvent anymore. We were profitable. Wildly profitable. Alexander started hiring again, adding developers and project managers to support the growth. My department, once the company's biggest liability, was now its primary engine of growth, and I had done absolutely nothing to contribute to it. In fact, the data was undeniable. The company's success was in direct inverse proportion to my involvement. The less I did, the better things got. This realization didn't come in a sudden flash. It was a slow, creeping dread that built up over several months. I would sit in meetings and listen to my team discuss complex problems with a level of passion and expertise I had actively tried to suppress. I had mistaken their quiet professionalism for a lack of vision. I had interpreted their focus on data as a lack of creativity. I had seen their methodical approach as aggressive and confrontational. I had diagnosed the disease, but I had gotten the patient wrong. The problem wasn't their toxic masculinity. The problem was me. One evening, I was the last one left in the office. It was late, maybe 8 or 9 p.m. I was just sitting at my desk, staring at the quarterly growth chart Alexander had sent out that afternoon. It looked like a hockey stick, a steep, beautiful upward curve. I pulled up the old reports from the year before, from when I was in full control. The charts were a sea of stagnant lines and gentle downward slopes. I put them side by side on my monitor. On the left, the results of my vision. On the right, the results of my absence. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for interpretation. The numbers didn't care about my theories on workplace dynamics. They didn't care about narratives or empathetic marketing. They were cold, hard, and ruthless. And they were telling me a story I had refused to read for over a year. I had created a hostile work environment. I had punished competence and rewarded silence. I had taken a team of skilled professionals and treated them like misbehaving children who needed to be constantly corrected and lectured. I called them fragile, but I was the one whose ego couldn't handle being challenged. I accused them of being toxic, but I was the one poisoning the well with my ideology. A deep, profound sense of shame washed over me. It was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight on my chest. I thought back to my lead tech guy, the one I had driven away. I had seen him as the villain of my story, the final boss of the patriarchy I had to defeat. But he wasn't a villain. He was just a guy who was good at his job and wanted to be allowed to do it. A guy I had systematically belittled and undermined until he had no choice but to leave. I minimized the screen and just sat there in the dark, quiet office. The reflection in the black monitor showed a tired, defeated-looking woman. Alexander's voice startled me. "Burning the midnight oil?" I hadn't even heard him approach. He was standing in my doorway holding a briefcase. I quickly turned back to my desktop, trying to hide what I was looking at. "Just finishing up a few things," I mumbled. He didn't leave. He walked into the office and stood beside my desk. He glanced at my screen, but he didn't comment on the charts. He just looked around the quiet department. "They're a good team," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said quietly. "They are." He was silent for a moment. "You've been doing a good job," he said. I actually flinched. The praise felt like a slap in the face. I shook my head. "No, I haven't." "They have." I finally looked up at him. I think it was the first time I'd made direct eye contact with him in months. "I was wrong," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, but also liberating. About everything. He didn't seem surprised. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The hardest part of being a leader," he said, "isn't having the right answers. It's realizing when you have the wrong ones." He looked at me, and his expression wasn't angry or triumphant. It was just neutral, maybe a little tired. "You've been letting them do their work," he continued. "You've stayed out of their way. That's what I needed you to do. And because you did, we're still here. The business is thriving." He turned to leave. "Get some rest, Helen," he said over his shoulder. "We've got a busy quarter ahead." And then he was gone. I sat there for a long time after he left. He had given me an out. He had reframed my forced compliance as a conscious leadership choice. He was giving me a chance to save face. But I knew the truth. The numbers knew the truth. I had almost destroyed a perfectly good company and the careers of the people in it because I was blinded by my own self-righteousness. The shock wasn't that the company grew when I stopped shaming the men on my team. The shock was realizing that they were never the problem. The problem was my belief that they had to be.